Thanks.
No. All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Jim Jansen, and we're going to go ahead and do introductions here as we have a few additional people joining us, and then we'll get started in a few minutes. So welcome to the February version of edition of Land Management Quarterly, and I'll switch to the next slide here. All right, so I'll introduce myself. I'll ask our co-host to do the same, and then we'll visit a little bit about what we'll be covering as we have a few last people joining us, and we'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Jim Jansen. I work as an agricultural economist here at the University of Nebraska in Eastern Nebraska. And I am also having Anastasia Meyer. Anastasia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Anastasia Meyer. I'm an ag economist with University of Nebraska, and I serve Southeast area.
Okay. Well, Anastasia is Alan Vanalik's used to co-lead this, and Anastasia will be taking the lead from Alan as he is fully retired now. And if we have questions as we're going along today, what we're going to be doing is you can either tap them into the Q&A or chat feature on the Zoom, I'll call it the Zoom bar. And we'll go ahead and look at that line. Just to save bandwidth, Anastasia, do you want to kill your video until you present, and then I'll kill mine at that point? All right. In the past, we've had some issues with the bandwidth, sometimes not quite being enough for everyone. But the general topics we're going to be covering today, I'll take the lead on the first half, and Anastasia will be taking the lead on the second half. The first half, we're going to be taking a look at cash rental rates, where everything's been since 2023, 3 into 2024. Give you some basic ideas on how do we calculate an actual cash rent. Anastasia will be taking the lead on some of the critical provisions. What are the things we need to be thinking on related to lease arrangements? Some of the commonly asked questions related to that. We had a couple of questions submitted to us. Anastasia will be answering the first 3, and I'll be taking the last 2. And as we're going along, you feel free to type in questions to the Q&A pane or the chat feature, and we'll address those when time is allowed towards the end of our presentation. So first thing, we're looking for sponsors for Land Management Quarterly. We've had different companies in the last year or 2 help us out. If you're interested in sponsoring one of these, during our presentation, we'll feature a slide that is provided with the contact information and highlight the different service or services that the company provides. And any of the sponsorship revenue that's generated helps support us in our efforts to do outreach on the topics of land values, cash rents, and lease arrangements. If you have questions, if you'd like to visit with someone, please reach out to myself or Anastasia Meyer, and we can answer any further questions or details going along with that. So first part, let's take a look at cash rental rates. So what I'll attempt to do here in the first half, and like I said, Anastasia will be leading the second. On the first half here, let's take a look at what the cash rental rates have been doing in 2023 to better understand where might things be headed in 2024. Sometimes you have to take a step back to see where things have been, kind of benchmark where we've been to understand where things might be headed in the future. First thing, with the annual farm real estate survey that's currently ongoing with the University of Nebraska, twice each year we do publications from it. First thing you'll notice in the second sub-bullet point is called the preliminary estimates. That's a snapshot on the current state of land values, and maybe more importantly for those joining us on the call today, cash rental rates. That information is published in the middle of March. We're actively working on collecting responses and tabulating data related to that. Final report comes out in June. The final report provides all the preliminary estimates information. In addition to the final report details, attributes of land sales, who's buying what, how our land finance is being done, things of that nature. And if you'd like to find updates, you can check out the website link. The slides we're going over today, including those with Anastasia presenting on, will be posted to the Land Management Quarterly website. And related to that, you can also go to your local extension office. Many of the office managers across the state typically have a page or 2 printed off that you can gain a copy from someone and gain additional insight on the current state of land values or cash rental rates. Okay. All right, first thing, let's review where the University of Nebraska information has been. We'll step through the USDA information on cash rents, and then I'll give you some basic ideas on how to calculate cash rental rates. As a reminder, this information is from the 2023 Nebraska Farm Real Estate Report. 2024 will be published in about 3.5 weeks or so, I guess a little less than a month. And this is the most recent information we have. So if you call Anastasia or myself, we don't have anything more recent than the 2023. What I encourage people to do is think about what is influencing cash rental rates. Obviously, the quality of the land, quality of the soil, market competitiveness of the area. Also, depending on where you're at in Nebraska, rainfall, commodity prices. Some of the examples we'll be working through, I'll give you some general ideas on that. And all these different features influence cash rents. Now, this is a regional estimate. The examples we'll work through are more of a farm level estimate. But nonetheless, you can gain some insight. How does cash rental rates vary around in the region of Nebraska where my property might be located that I either own or I operate on or rent to someone? So this is for 2023 dryland cropland cash rental rates. The center pivot irrigated rates is on the next slide here. The center pivot rates assume that the landlord provides the entire irrigation system. That's the pivot, pump, and power unit. If the tenant provides one of those features, you would discount the cash rent to account for the fact that the tenant is providing a portion of that improvement. And once again, all the different things that were briefly mentioned on influencing dry land cash rental rates also influence the irrigated location. You have nice soil. Is it a nice contiguous field? Is it a field that has a ditch or a stream or some unwanted trees or something that obstruct the ability to farm or run a pivot? All those different things influence the cash rental rates. And that's why we see some of the different cash rents bid across the state, as in Western Nebraska, the yield expectation or the level of risk might be different than, say, in Eastern Nebraska or Southeast or Northeast. So all those things are influencing it. And I would encourage you, as you're thinking through your 2024 cash rents, there's probably negotiations occurring regardless if you're a landlord or tenant. I'll ask you, how does 2023 stack up against 2024? Are yield expectations similar? I think crop prices are a little bit lower than they were in 2023 at this point. What are your other expectations for trade, for uses of the grains? Where are exports going to pick up? All these different things. So those are good things to negotiate, as well as the input expenses. One of the questions that came in just briefly when we started right away was basically, is it appropriate to share or ask the other party things like the inputs? What are you spending? What are you putting out there? And how does that influence the cash rental rates? Well, Anastasia will get into this a little bit more, but my one comment on this will be is you don't necessarily have to be having you don't have to ask the tenant, show me your checkbook, but a basic summary of, okay, what are the fertilizer practices? What are the input management strategies, practices, things like that? It's not inappropriate to ask for communicate between the landlord and the tenant, just like the yield. Now, the tenant might be a little hesitant to share that because they're concerned that if you have all that information in front of you, you're going to be shopping for the next best operator in the area. So that's why there's a little bit of rapport that has to be built between both parties involved. So basic things, especially at the per acre level, some of the examples I'll demonstrate, I think you might see why it's a good thing for both parties to share that type of information. Okay, we'll go to the next slide here. Onto the cow-calf pair rental rates. So we briefly talked about the dry land, cropland, the center pivot irrigated, and these are for the cow-calf pairs for one cow, one calf for 1 month during the summer grazing season. Now I'll pick on, let's say the Southwest District here just briefly, and we'll just call this $50 for the low third average. And I forgot to introduce this before as well. You'll notice for each region we have a range. The range is called HAL. HAL stands for the average of the high grade, average of the low grade, and the overall average. The average of the high grade, what that really is that's really the upper third of cash rental rates. The low grade is really the low third of cash rental rates. And then the overall average is kind of the overall average for the area. For the cow-calf pair monthly rates, if you would be renting for, let's say, 5 months, take 50 times 5, that is $250 a pair. Okay. So here's the breakout that we see. What influences grazing land cash rents? Well, okay. Are you in an area that has adequate moisture? Are you presuming it might be getting dry? So weather always influences these things. How good of a property do you have? Maybe the property is too wet to farm, but it makes exceptional pasture or rangeland. Other things, who's maintaining what, who's responsible for the different features out there. All those things influence the cash rental rates and some of the things that we see. Okay, so this is for 2023. This is a per month rate. The dry land and irrigated slides, those were also for the 2023 growing season as well. Wanted to introduce here, I think a lot of people have maybe seen these maps in the past. There's another survey that's done in the state of Nebraska. It's done independent of the University of Nebraska, and it's actually done by what we call NASS. NASS stands for the National Agricultural Statistics Service, and that's that 4-letter acronym that we see right there. And it's a survey of farmers and ranchers. Their information in recent years has been published, it seems like every year, and they publish county level estimates. And their information can be found at this great big long link here. I'll remind everyone today's slides will be posted online, so you can definitely find these at your convenience. And this information, the map was finally published. I think it was about the second week of October of 2023. The raw data was put out, I believe, in late August. And you can see a few things here. I tell folks this is kind of the cookie cutter slide relative to the regional averages. The reason I say it's a cookie cutter slide, let's pick on the South. Let's pick on the Central District. It seems to me maybe Greeley and Howard counties related to the university information, maybe even Valley, that might be the upper third of cash rental rates for their area, or maybe even Buffalo. Maybe Custer is closer to the lower third average, and maybe Sherman and Howard, or maybe Sherman and Dawson, Sherman, Howell, Dawson, maybe those are closer to the overall average for the area. This information is updated in the fall, so it's a little bit later in the year, but nonetheless, it's another good point, a good point place estimate to kind of gain some insight on how do those cash rental rates truly vary around in an area. And you also notice some of these counties that are in white, the counties that are in white, these areas either do not have a lot of, an example, there's not a lot of cropland out in the sandhills. American Hamilton are predominantly irrigated counties relative to dryland cropland. Or you might be in an area, some areas out here in western Nebraska, maybe they just don't have enough people to report. So that's why we see some of the non-published information by region of the state. The irrigated cropland cash rental rates for 2023, the USDA does not distinguish or divide out or segregate the center pivot irrigated from the flood or gravity irrigated rate. When they pull the two apart, they kind of create a weighted average. They don't pull them apart, they average them together. So an example, let's say if you're here in Hall County along Interstate 80, there's still a fair amount of flood or gravity irrigation. In Hall County, they come up with a weighted average. So an example, and I'll just make something up. Let's say in Hall or Adams County, a third of the irrigated cropland there is still flood or gravity irrigated. The average that they have reported here is going to be a weighted average that reflects the two of those in proportion to the number of acres. So if the third of the county is gravity irrigated and 2/3 of center pivot, the weighted average that we have reported here is what we see right here. Okay. And the USDA and the University of Nebraska also reports on this. The USDA reports on a per acre rental rate, not a per acre per month, but just a per acre rental rate. University of Nebraska does as well. And you can really gain some good insight in western Nebraska on how cash rental rates vary around out in some of these areas. Out in the North District, obviously the stocking rate varies quite a bit when you leave Polk County and head west over to Cherry County. And once again, some of these heavily irrigated counties do not have a lot of grazing land. So that's why we see some of these that we do here. And also Sarpy County, that would be the greater Omaha area, which there is agricultural land there, but it's more so on the cropland compared to the grazing land side. Okay. One other reminder I wanted to put out there, I know this is a season of a season of federal and state income taxes. We need to get these things filed in a timely manner. One of the things to be aware of, if you own agricultural land or a home in Nebraska, make sure you take advantage of what we call the state of Nebraska income tax credit. Now for 2023, how this credit works, 30% of your portion of the real estate taxes that you pay to your local K through 12 or community college district, not of your overall property tax burden, but of your county, your individual real estate taxes that you pay on a home or agricultural land, the portion that goes towards education, K through 12, or your local community college, 30% will come back in the form of an income tax credit. So make sure to take advantage of this credit. If you have not filed for this credit in recent years, you can amend your prior returns to get back what was owed on those years. I know there were millions of dollars set aside that were not taken advantage of for this credit. So make sure you take advantage of this credit. And this year, I believe it's being held steady at 30%. For 2022, it was also 30%. But make sure if you have someone doing your taxes for you, they're going to need to see like your annual property tax assessment notice that's sent out in late November or December. That is the type of information, along with the receipt, for example. That's the type of information that they'll want to see. So make sure you take advantage of that credit if you file a return and own a residential home or agricultural land in Nebraska. A few examples here. All right, so we're going to step back. If you come to our traditional in-person presentation, we tend to go over these. I'm going to go over 3 different examples. I was initially going to go over 2, but because of an additional question being sent in, we're going to go over the 3rd example. I know I briefly went over the cash rental rates by region, by county. Now we're working through the by farm examples. What do you notice here? Well, we might pick out a county in this, say in this made up county, the average county level cash rent's 190 an acre. And say you talk to like a crop insurance agent. A lot of the crop insurance agents have a pretty good idea on what the county yield might be. If you take the county rental rate divided by what we call the county yield, the county corn yield, county dryland corn yield, for example, this gives us what we call the county rent per bushel. In this example, $1.42 per bushel. If you take the county rent per bushel and slide it to the upper right-hand side right here, this gives us what we call the county rent per bushel. And we're taking what we know on the left-hand slide. So if you can figure out these numbers, whether you pull this regional or county level information from the numbers that were provided, or look forward to seeing what we have here in March, slide it to the upper right-hand side right here, that county rent per bushel. In this particular example, my farm does not yield as well as the county. It has an actual production history. And actual production history is just an average associated with crop insurance. If I take 119 bushel per acre times the county rent per bushel, that gives us the farm level cash rent. We adjust what we know on the left to apply it to what we might not know on the right-hand side. This is an example you can plug in if you know on your property, if you're looking to rent something or someone you're renting from offers you a certain cash rental rate. You want to kind of compare, how does that stack up against the county average? Well, you have to make sure you're comparing apples to apples, not apples to oranges. So just be aware of that. Second example, and this is one example that I just made up here today, and or I made up this past fall, and I probably should have updated the numbers a little bit. I think this was last November, December, and this is probably a good learning point to point out that commodity prices do change. Let's say we wanted to do a crop share, maybe a 50-50 crop share, and make it into a cash lease. Well, under this example, let's say we had a field that produces 160 bushel per acre. The landlord gets 50, or excuse me, gets 80. The tenant gets the other, the landlord gets 80 bushel per acre. The tenant gets the other 80 bushel per acre. Okay, so we're just splitting the yield right in half because we're doing a 50-50 crop share. Also, the landlord has to pay half of the seed, fertilizer, and chemical expenses, because in this example, we're doing a crop share. And you'll notice I used a price of $4.89 a bushel. Probably a little bit too high for our expectations here in March on what we think the commodity might be worth. Corn prices especially have stepped down some. So just make sure if you're going to modify my example, I'll plug in the appropriate number. Nonetheless, if you take away the landlord's share of the income, half of their share of the income minus half of their share of the expenses, this is what the landlord stands to make per acre. Well, if you say instead of what they stand to make per acre, if I was willing to offer the landlord a cash rent, let's say 195 or 200 bucks an acre. Under that case, the cash equivalent, the next opportunity value from the crop shares to do a cash lease. And doing that, we gained the cash equivalent from crop share. And by doing this, this is kind of one way to size up the cash rent. You know, if somebody offers you, or if you have to make an offer of so many dollars per acre, can you work backwards through this example? A landlord, can you work from the top down or the bottom up? If you're trying to draw up scenarios, and I just give the March, July, November scenarios here, but you know, throughout the growing season, the yield will definitely vary. It's never exactly what you expect it to be. Commodity prices, this is just an example where commodity prices went up. I'm afraid we might be looking at a year where prices probably going to be fairly steady throughout the year. I don't know if we're going to see a lot of upward trajectory, but you can draw up scenarios. So if the landlord and tenant are negotiating cash rents and they want to talk about prices and the tenant wants this price and the landlord thinks it's going to be this price, maybe you split the difference and you average the two prices on what you think it's going to be worth. It's just one way to figure out the cash rent, given all of these different things that we described here. Another example on cash rent is cash equivalent from hay share. So once again, we got two different examples of taking a crop share or a hay share in this example and making it into a cash rent. So in the center example, it's a 1/3, 2/3. On the far right example, it's 50-50 split. Under the far right example here, let's say the hay is going to be worth 180 a ton. It's really nice hay. Well, if the landlord gets 1/3 of the hay, they're not paying any expenses under a 1/3, 2/3. And the landlord says, I'll tell you what, why don't I buy out your share of the hay? Under that case, their third of the share is a landlord share. It's about $90 an acre. So if the tenant offers them 80, 90, 100, something in that ballpark, that would be taking a crop share or a hay share and making it into a cash rent. Second example here, under a 50-50 split, the landlord gets half of the yield, the tenant gets the other half. So under this case, the landlord and the tenant spent about $70 an acre. They threw some fertilizer out there and maybe sprayed the site for some weeds. Under this case, the landlord's paying half of the expenses, half the seed, fertilizer, chemicals. Difference between the landlord's share minus their share of the expenses. This is a 1/3. This happens to be 135 minus 35 is about 100. So cash equivalent from hay share, cash equivalent from crop share. This is one way you can draw up a cash rent. If you're uncertain on a lot of things, start plugging in what you know to come up with some of these examples we see here. And a final example, somebody asked a question that they had sent in. Let's talk about return on investment. Every investment has a return: land, rental properties, money in a bank. The rate of return on land is actually quite low relative to the annual appreciation in recent years. If you know what the market value is, so in this example, let's just say it's 7,500 for dry land, a little bit over 11,000. If you take the land value times the rate of return, that gives us the rental rate per acre. Market value times the rate of return. You cannot be using, let's say, a 5% rate of return, annual return on the property, because land is a fairly low risk investment. Now, the appreciation, yes, there's been years, in recent years, we've seen land in Nebraska increase about 30% in the last 2 years. It definitely has increased some. This is just kind of a rate of return, or what some folks might call the capitalization or the cap rates. You can look at land as return. If you looked at grazing land, you'd probably see a rate of return of less than 2% or around 2%. Dry land, cropland, 2.5%. Maybe irrigated, you might push a little bit over 3, but not very much. Okay, I'm going to kill my video here, and we'll let Anastasia get started here. And Anastasia, when you want to go to the next slide, to say next, and I'll flip it for you. I'll mute myself as well.
Okay. Jim, before you leave, do you want to answer that question?
All right. All right, well, let's answer this one quick. So the question that was submitted to us says, what is the best way to figure cash rent deductions when the tenant owns the irrigation equipment such as a pivot and power unit? As part of the 2023 cash rental rate survey, we actually attempted to address this. So, okay, let's just say, for example, I'm just making up numbers. Let's say the landlord and tenant think that the cash rent should be $350 an acre. What we've seen, and based on my call volume, we've seen there's usually an adjustment of about 35, and it can be more than that per acre when the tenant provides a pivot because the tenant's the one responsible for maintaining, insuring, whatever. And the power units, the numbers I've been hearing the most of in the last year have been around $15 an acre. So in our example, if you're paying $350 an acre in cash rent, but the tenant provides some of those things, in our example, you might take off about $50 an acre to account for the fact the landlord doesn't have to maintain, repair, or pay upkeep or insurance on those assets. So I'm seeing around 30, it can be less, but it seems like $35 an acre, even up to 45 on the really advanced systems is not uncommon to deduct, and around 10, 15 an acre on the power unit.
Okay. So I will get started then. We can move on to the next slide. So the first thing that I want to remind people is getting a written lease is very important. This isn't the days of in the past everything was verbal. The written lease, the landlord and the tenant, in case something happens, and it also just written down. You guys can refer to it. It's not what did we discuss about in the past, last year, 5 years ago. If you have a verbal lease, termination has to be given 6 months prior to March 1. So termination has to be given September previous year. Handshake agreements, verbal start March 1. So we're past that. If you're not happy your tenant and it is a verbal lease, you are stuck with them until the next year runs around. According to for some leases, they can be found at aglease101.org. We have a picture. You can see my mouse. We have an example one. They are fillable. You can type in, you can write in. And it does have different provisions in there that we can talk about that you guys can write in this example. You can go on to the next slide. Next. Yep. Okay. So this is a website, Aglease 101. You can click document library. You will find this page on. Go ahead. You'll see forms, and these are the ones you can download and put in your information. And you have everything from pasture leases, crop share, cash lease, as well as different. Nebraska doesn't have the capacity to the surveys on leasing, farm buildings, stuff that isn't just as common as you're in the farm ground. So these are some good information on what you should for your Quonset that has a concrete floor. It has it by age. It really breaks it down well. All right, can you guys hear me well enough?
Anastasia, why don't you kill your video? I think if you do that, you'll save a little bit of bandwidth, and we'll just do, oh goodness.
Okay, is this better, guys?
Yep.
Okay. Jim, I lost the
Yep.
presentation. I see. Okay, there we go.
But
Do you want me to start over, guys?
tell you what, why don't we switch back here? why don't you just, you were in and out quite a bit, Anastasia. Why don't you just repeat what you did say
Oh,
here briefly, and we'll just start from here. Is that okay?
yep, that's fine. Okay, so it's important to get written leases. It not only protects tenants and owners, it protects everybody from forgetting what they said 2 years ago, 1 year ago. Life happens, but a verbal handshake lease. Termination must be given by September 1 of the previous year. If you are unhappy with your current tenant and you want to terminate their lease, if it's too late for the leases start on March 1. That if you have a written lease, it doesn't have to follow these dates. If you need here, I'm going to unhook my headphones. Maybe that's the issue. Okay, is this better, guys?
I can hear you pretty good
You guys
now.
need an example of releases that you guys can go and then fill in your information. You guys can go to aglease101.org. They have an example here. The lease is off to the side. You guys can fill in your own information. It has the fill in the blanks where you guys can put specific clauses, anything that you need to. Jim, let's go to the next slide. So Ag Lease 101 is a great resource for anybody to use. If you click on the document, which is highlighted here, Jim, go on to the next. You can find, oh, we went too far. You can find lease publications that have not only cash rental rates for your farm, but what I really like about this website is it has examples of how much you should charge for your Quonset that the tenant is parking their tractor in, that Nebraska and other universities don't have the capacity to do those surveys because they're not commonly rented out. And then on the right-hand side, we have lease forms. These are the forms that you're going to download for your farm, and then you can edit them, put in your information, save them, update them from year to year. They're great resources. You're going to look at them and think that they might be a little bit lengthy, but you don't have to fill out everything. They just give examples for what you can fill out. Go on to the next. So, like I said earlier, it might be too late to change some lease provisions for 2024 starting March 1. If you have a verbal lease. Lots of people are looking at what they should be charging this year. We discussed the rental rates. You can put in your lease the provision of when you guys are going to set this rental rate. You guys can put that in a provision that every year you're going to update if you have a multiple year. Like Jim mentioned earlier, we want to pay attention to crop prices. Unfortunately, I think we're coming off of some high prices, and the rental rates tend to lag behind that a year or so. It's always important that we conserve our soil, and we manage different weeds, pressures, improve fertility. There might be somebody who can pay top dollar, but maybe they're not providing the soil conservation that you want. Are your tenants going out there and doing some light disking of ditches that were made during the year? Are they controlling the noxious weeds out there? Are they controlling the different insect pressures? And are they mining all of your fertility out of your soil? That's something that to consider in a lease. Maybe you do a soil test at the beginning and you do a soil test at the end. When inputs get high and crop prices get low, phosphorus is the first nutrient to mine out of the soil. So this way, in case they are no longer farming for you, you have that same level of phosphorus.
And
The line is
oh,
another thing to think about. If you are doing a year-to-year lease, you need to think about a provision for Lyme because Lyme is typically lasting 5 years. And so if you terminate, you need to think about prorating out the value of the leftover Lyme to whoever paid for it. Typically, Lyme is a landlord expense, but we do see some farmers pay for it completely with the clause in there that if they are terminated before the life of that Lyme is used up, that the value is prorated back to them. Jim, we can go on to the next slide.
Why don't we take just two quick questions here? I'll read them to you. Is the March 1st start date for farm ground, which I think when they say farm ground, we're implying, let's say, dry land or irrigated cropland. Is that the
We
same
have
for
a couple
using?
questions here. Must written leases be signed by March 1? It is going to be dependent on what's wrote in that lease. It doesn't have to be. If you want to start different days, you can start different days, but it has to be written in that lease. If your lease states that I'm signing it. It goes from March 1, 2024 to February 28th, 28th of 2025. That lease terminates then. You don't have to send me a letter. If you want to have different days in there, you can, but just be cognitive of the growing seasons.
Okay, very good. We'll go to the next slide here.
We'll answer this next question later. Other lease considerations that I like to think about is timing of lease payments, especially as interest rates are getting higher for producers. If you require all of your lease payment upfront, they are carrying that lease payment until harvest. What I typically like to see is half of it or a part of it paid for when you guys talk about or sign a new lease. And then half at harvest time. Irrigation equipment, like Jim mentioned earlier, who owns and who maintains the pivot? If the landlord owns the pivot, typically in a lease, there is a deduction amount that up until the first $500, $1,000, depending on what you guys put in that lease, the tenant is responsible for paying for. So if you have some gearboxes go out, the tenant is going to pay for that up until a certain amount is paid for. And then that's when the landowner will pay if the landowner owns it. Fertility and manure management. If your tenant puts on manure fertilizer, I would limit that to once a year. You can get a buildup of too much nutrients in the soil from the manure, and you end up you can end up doing more damage to your crops. For stock removal, I typically think that if the tenant is doing all of the labor, if the tenant is putting up that electric fence, going and watering the cows every single day, the landowner is providing no input whatsoever, let those cows go out there and graze if they are the tenants. Typically, we don't charge anything for that because they are getting rid of some of that extra residue. They're breaking it down. They're putting the nutrients back into the soil. Now, the thing would be if you do a 60-40 crop share agreement and they rent it to somebody else, then you would want your 40% or 50%, however much your crop share is. And another thing I like to think about is hunting rights. Are you a hunter? Is your family a hunter? Do you like to go fishing? If you are, then you need to put in your written contract that you retain the rights to hunt. Because if you do not, technically, the tenant has the right to hunt and could kick you off for trespassing for hunting. He could sign or they could sign the hunting rights over to a hunting contractor company, and nobody could be hunt there unless they're getting hired out to do that. So if you want to hunt, if you want to fish, you need to retain those rights and it needs to be in a written lease. Jim, we can go to the next. So pasture and grazing land typically has a 5-month lease. It typically runs from May to October or June to November. If it is a verbal lease, notice of termination is not required because that lease only runs from May to October or June to November. The oral lease does not require a 6-month notification because at the end of that grazing period, that is done. It ends each year. So if you have a hunting, if you want to go hunting here and you just have an oral verbal handshake agreement, you don't need to have that special clause in there. When you do need to terminate a pasture lease is if you have a written multi-year lease. If you have a carryover clause that you guys sign for 1 year and then you have a clause in there that every year you're just going to reevaluate the pasture rent and then this contract carries over from year to year to year, then yes, you need to terminate and you need to retain hunting rights. But on a verbal lease, you do not need to retain hunting rights and you do not need to terminate. Who controls noxious weeds and brush? Alan always likes to say the other guy, and that's because if you ask the other person, it's always the other guy. Typically, it is the landowner is going to be the one receiving the nasty letters from the county if you have noxious weeds. And you're going to be liable if they have to go out and the county has to go and control those weeds. Typically, what is done is the cedars along the fence rows, landowners are responsible for taking care of. Cedars and pastures, tenants usually take care of either by burning in the in a typical relationship that I see is the landowner pays for the chemical and the producer goes out there and sprays it. That's typically if there's a big issue out there in the pasture. If there's just a few noxious weeds, the tenant should just go out there and take control of it. But if you're really rehabbing a pasture, consider as a landowner paying for the chemical and the tenant provides the labor. If there's a fire, hail, and drought, you guys need to be thinking, do you have it in the lease that they pull the cattle off earlier or not? That's one thing that's important about having a written lease too for pasture, that if there's no grass out there, are you going to let them stay in there or pull them out? When will it be adjusted? How will the payments be adjusted? I The rental rates for pastures are by month. So if you do pull them out, maybe they just pay at the end and then they just deduct that extra month. Okay, Jim. Next. All right.
All right.
So these are some commonly asked questions that we receive. So when should cash rent be due for my crop or grazing lease? It varies from party to party, from one to another. Typically, a portion is due or all of it is due at the signing of the lease, and then the remaining is due in the fall. We like to suggest March 1 half, November 1 half, or you could also break it down into thirds. March 3rd, June a third, and November a third. Just be cognitive of when does the landowner need the money, aka when is taxes due, and yeah, just be cognitive of cash flows. You don't want to be waiting on that cash rental payment if you have upcoming taxes due, land taxes. And then who should pay the bill if the tenant hires a third party to make repairs on a pivot, the landlord or the tenant? So this is what I like. A good written lease should specify. It should specify who's doing the repairs, who is in charge of
paying for what? It's a large investment if you have, usually your multi-year leases are going to be the people who put pivots on the field or some sort of a large investment like Lime. So if you're doing that, have the clause, and then if the deductible, if you own it, the first typically $500 to $1,000 is what the tenant is responsible for paying. Unless they own the pivot, then they're responsible for paying for all of it. A third party, after the deductible, it would be the landlord. Right. Should you rent out your land on a multiple or single year lease? In the past, a lot of them have been multi-year leases. There's no set standards, but if you do have a multi-year lease, I would put in the clause that you need to reevaluate every single year what the rental rate is. You don't want to be stuck at one rate if crop prices go up, and the tenant doesn't want to be stuck at a high rate if crop prices go down. So just have that set in there, that the clause every year during a certain time you're going to reevaluate. Like I said earlier, if they made a large investment, that's when you're going to look at a multi-year lease. More people are going to a single lease. Some are going to a single year lease that just has that holdover clause, which you guys can do. But as long as you guys get something in writing and whatever the relationship is, works for you guys. If you guys are just trying out a new tenant or you guys just inherited a land, maybe try that 1 year lease. See how the relation is going, and then you guys can reevaluate. I typically don't see leases longer than 5 years.
Yeah. All right, Anastasia, can you hear me at all?
There is a question here saying who should pay for the soil testing? How often should it be done once you get a baseline? So as the landlord, since you're setting this requirement, you would pay for the soil testing. And then you would pay for the soil testing, or they would pay, you guys could negotiate that out. But the first initial soil test would be on you guys. There are pretty economical soil tests that you guys can run. Sorry. There's pretty economical soil tests. You guys don't have to do the super expensive just to get a baseline. Let's see. Another question is it okay to establish cash rent after final crop insurance rates are established and costs for growing crops are known in the fall, providing that this is agreeable with the tenant and landowner? It takes the variable yields and cost of production out of the question. Yes, it is okay to establish cash rent after those. It's just communication, guys, is something that I really want to preach. You guys can agree on whatever you guys want to. It's just as long as you have the communication and you guys, both parties are willing to set that. But if the contracted land tenant no longer does the physical farm functions, but hires out planting and harvesting, does this require a new contract? Should we continue to rent out or have a land manager? First, I'm going to tackle the land manager question. If you guys want a land manager, go for it. A land manager typically takes about 10%, but your tenant, just a heads up, will have a very adverse reaction to you bringing up a land manager. For some reason, farmers have this aversion to land managers. Personally, I think the farmers just take it as a personal offense, that think that they are not being trustworthy. So that's why you're getting a land manager. Land managers are out there. Find one that works for you. But you don't have to have a new contract for that, as long as there's not a clause in there that says that there's no custom work being done. yeah, you could continue to rent out. Or you could get somebody else, but there's no reason why you would have to have a new tenant because they're doing some custom harvesting and planting on that field.
Yeah, Anastasia, can you hear me at all now?
Okay. We do have another webinar coming up Monday, May 20th. We're gonna talk about Jim's cash rental rates that he's working on right now for 2024 and the financial implications behind them. We're going to talk about this communication and decision making, long-term decisions, short-term decisions.
All right, sorry, Anastasia might be having some trouble right now. Jim, we can hear you if you want to take over and wrap things up here.
All right, sorry about that, folks. We've been having technical difficulties on our call today. I didn't know if everyone could hear me or not. Let me just I skipped over a couple of slides here. I'm just going to cover these quick. And then, so Anastasia talked about lease arrangements, how to handle things, how to pull things together.
Okay,
me
Jim,
cover
are you taking the next couple ones? Is your
Yes.
microphone working?
So, yes, it is. Let me type this. Yes. All right. So what we'll talk about here, a few things I wanted to point out when it came to lease arrangements. One, when we talk about lease arrangements, we're talking about annual one-to-one, usually a 1 year, 3 year, maybe 5 year lease at tops. Some of the things that we've been seeing in the news recently on the topic of easements or eminent domain, these are features that are going to last many, many years, or maybe even acquiring land from the owner of the property. One question that was sent in to us that we evaluated a little bit: can you be forced to provide an easement on land to allow, say, a carbon or hydrogen pipeline to be built? Well, under the Nebraska Public Service Commission, they typically allow eminent domain under what we call a common carrier. Currently, some of these things like carbon pipelines, for example, are not considered to be common carriers under traditional established statutes in Nebraska. And with that being said, infrastructure that has more so been established, so think of things like crude oil pipelines, natural gas pipelines, those things are more, they would fall more so under what we call these eminent domain, or the ability to purchase land or secure an easement. Carbon or hydrogen pipelines currently don't fall under that. So just be aware that is something that has changed. And also, when we talk about wind turbines, do they qualify? So the question is a little message that got sent to us on this. Wind turbines are not considered a common carrier to gain access to the land. And the electrical generation line, so you might have a big field and you got all these wind turbines out there producing all kinds of energy. If the electric company has to come in and put in some type of a large energy transmission line, that would fall under what we consider to be common carriers. So there is a difference between wind turbines and crude oil or hydrogen, or excuse me, hydrogen pipelines or carbon pipelines versus traditionally established infrastructure such as crude oil, natural gas pipelines, or even the energy generation from a solar field or wind turbines, things like that. And the other thing, what about solar panels? Can you be forced to provide an easement for a solar panel development on your land? I have not seen anything where they compel landowners to have an easement. What I typically see with solar panel development, they tend to focus on long-term lease arrangements. So they actually want to rent your ground from you for a long period of time. Usually the leases are 10 to 20, 30 years long. And then the landlord, just like if you rented it out for cropland, you'll be receiving a payment for that. So lease terms spell out the terms of this. And as always, if you're getting into some of these things, just be aware that always seek out guidance and from an attorney at law, someone representing your interests, please. And final thing, to help support our farm real estate survey and report, please reach out to the University of Nebraska Foundation. And with the NU Foundation, you can make a small donation if you'd like to see some additional information, especially on land values or cash rental rates. So that is all our slides for today. I thank everyone for joining us. And please stay tuned. We will be posting the slides. I know the audio wasn't very good today, but please reach out if you have additional questions. Thank you for joining.